The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The steady hum of hushed whispers filled the space as people gathered to witness what was expected to be an open-and-shut case. At the plaintiff's table, a woman sat with her hands clasped together, her expression unreadable. Across from her, the man who had once promised her forever lounged confidently in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. He had no doubt in his mind that the verdict would go his way. The judge's gavel struck, silencing the murmurs, and the divorce trial began. Her soon-to-be ex-husband, a wealthy and well-connected businessman, exuded arrogance. His sharp navy blue suit, meticulously styled hair, and the air of superiority that surrounded him painted the picture of a man who believed himself untouchable. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching his wife with amusement as though she were nothing more than an insignificant obstacle he was about to brush aside. He had already won in his mind, and now, it was just about ensuring she left with nothing. The opposing attorney, his own personal pit bull, stood up, adjusting his tie as he began his attack. "Your Honor, this case is simple. My client, a successful entrepreneur, has provided everything in this marriage. The woman sitting before you contributed nothing. She had no career, no income, and no assets of her own. She simply lived off my client's generosity for years. And now? Now she wants half of his hard-earned fortune? This is absurd." The audience chuckled, and even the judge's lips twitched as if he were already convinced. She remained still, her expression unchanged, her fingers barely twitching on the table. The words didn't faze her, nor did the laughter that followed. If anything, her silence only seemed to irritate her husband further. He leaned forward slightly, the smirk widening. "You really think you deserve anything, huh?" His voice was low, taunting. "You were nothing before me, and you'll be nothing after me." The crowd responded with another murmur, feeding into the entertainment of his cruelty. Her attorney gently placed a hand on her arm, a silent encouragement. She finally lifted her gaze, her dark eyes meeting her husband's with a steadiness that sent an unfamiliar chill down his spine. She didn't blink. She didn't react. She simply waited. Years ago, their love had been different. There was a time when she had been the center of his world, when he had looked at her with admiration rather than disdain. When they had first met, she had been fresh out of college, full of dreams and ambitions. He had swept her off her feet with promises of a life filled with adventure and security. She believed in him, in them, and had been willing to sacrifice everything to support his dreams. The first few years of marriage had been a whirlwind. He had been struggling to get his business off the ground, and she had done everything in her power to support him. She managed their home, handled his paperwork, and even took on freelance work to help keep their finances afloat. Late nights were spent poring over business strategies, offering him encouragement when he doubted himself, ensuring that his dreams would one day become reality. But success had changed him. As his company flourished, so did his ego. He no longer needed her words of encouragement, no longer sought her advice. He surrounded himself with people who flattered him, who reinforced the idea that he had built everything on his own. His appreciation for her sacrifices faded, replaced by condescension. He began to see her not as a partner, but as a burden, a woman who had simply ridden the coattails of his success. It started with small things. Dismissive remarks. Ignoring her at events. Rolling his eyes when she spoke. Then, it escalated. He belittled her in front of others, joked about how she did nothing while he worked tirelessly. He controlled the finances, ensuring she had no access to their wealth. She had become a prisoner in her own home, a shadow of the woman she once was. And now, he was determined to cast her out entirely. "I built everything with my own 2 hands," he declared to the court, his voice booming with false righteousness. "I gave her a luxurious life, yet she brought nothing to the table. No job. No assets. No investments. She sat at home while I was out making millions." His lawyer nodded approvingly, while the onlookers murmured in agreement. The judge, an older man with tired eyes, folded his hands and turned to her. "And what do you have to say about these claims?" She finally moved, adjusting the microphone in front of her. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm but firm. "I have been silent for too long," she said, her words slicing through the arrogance in the room. "But now, it's time for the truth." He let out a short, mocking laugh. "Truth? The truth is, you've done nothing your entire life. Just admit it. You're a nobody." A few people in the courtroom snickered, but she didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of documents, placing them on the table in front of her. Her attorney stood and handed them to the judge, who raised a curious eyebrow before flipping through the pages. "This," she said, gesturing toward the documents, "is proof that I was not a passive participant in our marriage. Every financial document, every business proposal, every strategic decision made in the early years of his company, I wrote them. I structured them. I laid the groundwork for the very empire he now claims as his own." Her husband's smirk faltered. The judge's expression changed as he scanned through the documents. "Is this accurate?" he asked, turning toward her husband. His lawyer hesitated before responding. "Your Honor, these documents." "Answer the question," the judge interrupted. Her husband's face was a shade paler. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't anticipated that she had kept everything. He opened his mouth to argue, but for the first time in years, he realized he had underestimated her. She leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "You always thought I was naive," she said quietly. "You assumed I had no value because I let you shine. But I knew exactly what I was doing. And I knew you would do exactly this." Her husband swallowed hard. His bravado was cracking. The courtroom was no longer laughing. And for the first time since the trial began, the power had shifted. The silence in the courtroom stretched, thick and suffocating, as the judge continued flipping through the documents with an unreadable expression. Her husband, once lounging with arrogance, now sat upright, fingers tapping against the polished wood of the defendant's table. His lawyer cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably, before muttering something under his breath. But the damage was already done. The evidence was there, black and white, undeniable. The judge set the papers down and adjusted his glasses before speaking. "Mr. Lancaster, according to these documents, your company was not solely built on your efforts. In fact, it appears that your wife, the plaintiff, was not only instrumental in your business's foundation but also in its financial management and structuring during its formative years." He paused, giving the man before him a piercing look. "Would you care to explain why this was not disclosed earlier?" Her husband clenched his jaw, searching for the arrogance that had once dripped from his voice, but all that came out was a weak scoff. "She just handled some paperwork. That doesn't mean she built my company." His voice wavered slightly, betraying his confidence, but he quickly masked it with an eye roll. "Come on, Your Honor, every businessman has someone managing the numbers. That doesn't mean they're responsible for the success." But before the judge could respond, she spoke. "Is that so?" she asked, her voice still eerily calm. Then, by your logic, the financial planning, the risk mitigation strategies, the legal structuring, and the investor negotiations I facilitated, all of which are documented here, had no impact on the company's growth? Her eyes locked onto his, and in them, he saw something terrifying: certainty. The courtroom murmured, the tide of perception shifting against him. For years, she had remained silent, endured his belittlement, let him write the narrative of their marriage. But now, she was no longer the woman who had bowed her head in submission. Now, she was the woman holding the receipts, the evidence, the irrefutable proof that she had not only contributed to his empire but had made it possible in the first place. The judge tapped his gavel lightly to silence the growing whispers, then turned his attention to her. "Mrs. Lancaster," he said, his tone less dismissive than it had been at the start of the trial, "would you care to elaborate on your role in the company's early days?" She nodded once, fingers brushing the edge of the documents before her. "In the first 5 years," she began, her voice steady but firm, "I not only handled the financial planning but also secured crucial investors by leveraging my own connections from my previous field. I structured the contracts, managed payroll, and personally developed the employee incentive programs that significantly reduced turnover in the initial stages." She leaned back slightly, letting the words settle. "At one point, when the company faced a financial crisis, I took out a loan under my name to cover operational costs, ensuring he wouldn't have to file for bankruptcy." She turned to the judge. "I have the bank records to prove this, if needed." Her husband's face darkened, his hands balling into fists on the table. "This is ridiculous," he hissed, but the panic in his voice betrayed him. It was as though a dam had broken. She had been silent for so long, enduring years of being dismissed, of having her contributions erased, but now the truth was out in the open. Every word she spoke tightened the noose around his false narrative. His lawyer, once smug, now shuffled through papers desperately, trying to find a counterargument. But what could they say? The documents were real. The records were damning. The court wasn't just witnessing a divorce, they were witnessing the dismantling of a carefully curated lie. The judge steepled his fingers, his gaze shifting between her and the man who had tried to erase her from his legacy. "Mr. Lancaster," he said slowly, his voice carrying an air of finality, "if these claims hold, then your wife, excuse me, the plaintiff, is entitled to far more than what was initially proposed." Her husband shot out of his seat. "This is my company," he snapped, his composure finally breaking. "I built it. I ran it." He stopped, realizing that the more he spoke, the more desperate he sounded. He sucked in a breath, smoothing his tie, then forced a laugh. "All right. Fine. Let's say she helped. That doesn't mean she deserves half." His lawyer, clearly sensing his unraveling, intervened. "Your Honor," he said hastily, "while we acknowledge that the plaintiff may have had some involvement in the early financial structure, we contest the claim that she was instrumental enough to warrant a significant portion of the company's assets." He forced a thin-lipped smile. "We would like to call for an independent financial review before any conclusions are drawn." She expected that. In fact, she had counted on it. "That won't be necessary," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. She reached for another folder, sliding it across the table. "I anticipated that my contributions would be minimized in this trial. That's why I had a forensic accountant review all financial records before we stepped into this courtroom." The judge's eyebrows lifted as he took the file, flipping through it while the defense lawyer scrambled to object. This is highly unusual," he stammered. "Your Honor, this should have been disclosed beforehand." But the judge held up a hand. "Sit down," he said firmly, then turned his attention back to the documents. A long silence stretched across the room as he read. Finally, he exhaled, setting the papers down with an almost amused expression. "Well," he said, looking at her husband with something bordering on pity, "it appears your wife didn't just help run your company. It appears she built it alongside you." He turned to her. "According to these findings, you are not only entitled to half of the business assets, but given that your name was left off essential documentation despite your financial backing, there is now a case for fraudulent omission." Her husband visibly paled. His lawyer, suddenly drenched in sweat, leaned toward him, whispering frantically. She tilted her head slightly, watching the panic bloom in her husband's eyes. For years, he had controlled the narrative, manipulated her into believing she was insignificant. But here, in front of a judge, in front of an audience, his power over her crumbled. He had underestimated her. He had assumed she would walk away with nothing, humiliated and broken. Instead, she was standing taller than ever, wielding the one thing he feared most, the truth. He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" The arrogance was gone now, replaced by something else. Something raw. Something desperate. She considered his question for a long moment before answering. "I want justice." And by the way his shoulders sagged, she knew he finally understood. This time, he wasn't going to win. The weight of the revelation settled over the room like a thick fog. The spectators, who had chuckled at her expense just moments ago, now exchanged murmurs of disbelief. Some shook their heads, others leaned in eager to catch every word. Even the judge seemed to sit taller, his gaze locked onto her husband as if daring him to dispute the truth. The defense lawyer, previously so sure of his client's dominance in the case, now looked like a man standing on the edge of a crumbling cliff. He rifled through his papers, seeking an escape, but there was none. The evidence was damning, undeniable. Her husband's lips parted, but no sound came out. For the first time, he was speechless. His usual bravado had vanished, replaced by a growing sense of unease. He had walked into this courtroom expecting a quick victory, expecting to walk away with everything while leaving her with nothing. Yet now, the balance of power had shifted. She had played the long game, and he was just realizing how expertly he had been outmaneuvered. His fingers drummed against the table, a nervous tick he had never displayed before. He turned to his lawyer, eyes pleading, but the man only swallowed hard and looked away. She wasn't done yet. Not even close. Taking a slow breath, she reached for another folder, her movements deliberate, precise. "Your Honor," she said, sliding the document forward, "there is one more detail that has yet to be discussed." The judge accepted the file, his eyes scanning the contents, his expression shifting from neutral to intrigued. He flipped through the pages with increasing speed before looking up. "This," he hesitated, then glanced at her husband. "Mr. Lancaster, were you aware that your prenuptial agreement includes an addendum regarding intellectual and financial contributions?" Her husband stiffened. "What?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying his growing panic. He whipped his head toward his lawyer, who was already skimming through the paperwork, his face turning ashen. "No," the lawyer muttered under his breath, "this wasn't in the original documents I reviewed." He flipped to a highlighted section, eyes widening. Oh no. The realization hit them both like a freight train. Buried within the prenuptial agreement, in a clause so often overlooked, was a provision stating that if she had made significant financial or intellectual contributions to any joint ventures, she would be entitled to full compensation, plus damages, should those contributions be concealed. The judge exhaled slowly, tapping a finger against the desk as he read aloud. In the event that one party's contributions to shared assets are not properly acknowledged, the disadvantaged party shall be entitled to no less than 75% of the total evaluated worth of said assets, in addition to any funds necessary for reparations. The words echoed through the silent courtroom, each syllable hammering nails into the coffin of her husband's case. He lurched forward, his breath uneven. "That's ridiculous," he barked, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "That clause is nothing but legal jargon. It doesn't apply here." "Oh, but it does," she countered smoothly. "That clause was drafted specifically to protect against situations like this. You insisted on the prenup, but you were too arrogant to read the fine print." She let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. "And now, by trying to erase my contributions, you've ensured that I receive the majority of your assets instead of just half." Her husband slammed a fist onto the table, his face contorted with fury, but it was too late. He had been outplayed, and the entire courtroom knew it. The judge leaned back in his chair, observing the scene before him with something close to amusement. "Mr. Lancaster," he said, adjusting his glasses, "it seems your wife was not as uninvolved in your success as you previously claimed. In fact, based on these findings, it is clear that she was a fundamental part of your company's foundation. Given the clause in your prenuptial agreement, this court will have no choice but to reconsider the division of assets in her favor." He tapped his gavel lightly, signaling the shift in the case. "If there are no further objections, we will proceed with recalculating the settlement based on these new findings." Her husband shot to his feet. "You can't be serious. This is my company, my work," but the judge cut him off with a single raised hand. "Sit down, Mr. Lancaster." His voice was firm, brokering no argument. This court does not look kindly upon deception, nor does it tolerate attempts to manipulate legal proceedings. He gestured to the defense lawyer. "Unless your counsel can provide compelling evidence to dispute these documents, I am prepared to rule in favor of the plaintiff." The lawyer hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of the table, before exhaling in defeat. We have no further objections, Your Honor." Her husband's face twisted in horror, his carefully constructed empire slipping through his fingers like sand. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was supposed to walk away with nothing. He was supposed to emerge victorious, free to continue his life of luxury without her. But now, with a single ruling, everything had changed. The courtroom was no longer his stage, it was her triumph. His wealth, his status, his future, it was all in jeopardy, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He opened his mouth to speak, to fight, to beg, but the words wouldn't come. He had spent years treating her as insignificant, as disposable. And now, the very woman he had dismissed was about to strip him of everything. He glanced at the judge, at the jury, at the spectators who once laughed alongside him but now watched in fascination as his downfall played out. He had lost. And worse than losing, he had been defeated by the very person he had underestimated the most. The gavel came down with a finality that sealed his fate. "The court rules in favor of the plaintiff," the judge announced. "She will receive 75% of shared assets, as per the contractual agreement, and an additional settlement for damages incurred through financial omission." He turned to her. "Mrs. Lancaster, you are entitled to these provisions effective immediately." We will proceed with the finalization of the divorce settlement in the coming weeks." A stunned silence followed. Then, a ripple of whispers spread through the room, people murmuring in awe at what had just unfolded. She stood slowly, smoothing out the creases in her dress. She had come into this courtroom prepared for battle, and now she was walking out victorious. Without sparing her husband another glance, she gathered her papers and turned toward the exit. The moment she stepped past the defendant's table, she heard it, the strangled sound of his breath hitching, the first sign of defeat escaping his lips. But she didn't stop. He was no longer her problem. He never would be again. The moment the ruling was announced, the courtroom became a whirlwind of whispers, gasps, and shifting expressions. Her husband remained motionless, his mouth slightly agape as if his mind was still processing what had just happened. His once proud posture had collapsed inward, his shoulders hunched in disbelief. His lawyer, usually so composed, wiped a hand across his forehead, muttering something under his breath. This was more than just a legal loss, this was a public humiliation. The onlookers, who had once laughed at her expense, now stared at him, their curiosity tinged with something else, pity. She took her time gathering her documents, placing them neatly in her bag as if this were nothing more than a routine business transaction. And in a way, it was. She had spent years preparing for this moment, ensuring that when the time came, she wouldn't just walk away, she would win. As she turned to leave, her husband finally found his voice. "Wait," he said, his tone stripped of arrogance. "We can talk about this. We don't have to end things like this." The desperation in his voice was almost comical. He had spent years tearing her down, only to realize too late that she had been the foundation he stood on. Without her, he had nothing. She stopped but didn't turn around. There was no satisfaction in his defeat, only a sense of finality. "This is exactly how it should end," she said, her voice steady, controlled. "You made sure of that." The weight of her words seemed to hit him all at once. His hands clenched at his sides, his mind racing for something, anything, that could undo the damage. He had always believed he could talk his way out of anything, manipulate any situation to his advantage. But now, he was out of moves. His power had come from underestimating her, and now, that same arrogance had become his undoing. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something frantically, but he wasn't listening. His focus was solely on her. "We were a team once," he tried again, his voice softer, almost pleading. "You don't have to do this. Just take half. Walk away. Let's fix this." She turned to face him then, tilting her head slightly as if genuinely considering his words. "I was a team," she corrected. "You were just the one taking the credit." The finality in her voice made his stomach drop. There would be no second chances, no quiet settlements, no salvaging his reputation. This was his reckoning, and she was done listening. The judge had left the bench, and the spectators began filing out, their voices hushed with awe. Some glanced at her with newfound respect, while others looked at her husband with the same curiosity one would have for a man who had lost everything in a single moment. She walked past him, unhurried, graceful, and paused just as she reached the door. Without turning back, she spoke loud enough for everyone still lingering in the room to hear. "You always said I was nothing without you." She let the words settle, let them fester the way his words had festered in her heart for years. "Now, let's see how you fare without me." With that, she stepped into the hallway, leaving behind a man who had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable. There was no victory lap, no moment of celebration. This wasn't about revenge, it never had been. It was about reclaiming what was hers, about ensuring that the woman he had spent years diminishing would never be overlooked again. She walked through the courthouse doors into the sunlight, inhaling deeply. It was the first breath of true freedom she had taken in years, and it tasted nothing like bitterness. It tasted like peace. By the time she reached the courthouse steps, the world had already taken notice. A small cluster of reporters stood at the entrance, their cameras flashing, their microphones thrust forward. The case had been closely watched, not just because of the wealth involved, but because of the power dynamic that had played out so publicly. A once influential businessman, brought to his knees by the very woman he had dismissed. She hesitated for only a moment before continuing forward, ignoring the shouted questions. "Did you always plan this?" one voice called out. "What will you do with your share of the company?" asked another. She paused, turning slightly, her expression unreadable. "I'm going to do exactly what I was always meant to do," she said simply. "Build." And with that, she walked away, leaving them scrambling to piece together what that could mean. Her husband had always assumed that without him, she would crumble. But what he had failed to realize was that she had been the architect all along. And now, she was free to build something that was truly hers. Inside the courthouse, her husband remained frozen in his seat, staring blankly at the table before him. The reality of his situation was finally setting in, a cold and unforgiving weight pressing against his chest. His assets, his company, his empire were slipping from his grasp. He had spent years ensuring that she remained invisible, and now the world saw her for exactly who she was, the mastermind behind his success. And worse, they saw him for who he truly was, a fraud, a man who had built his fortune on the back of a woman he had never valued. The press wasn't kind. The headlines painted him as a fallen mogul, a man who had underestimated his wife and paid the ultimate price. His business associates began distancing themselves, investors pulling out, the board of directors whispering about whether he could remain in his position at all. He had always believed that power meant control. But now, he understood the truth: power belonged to those who knew how to wield it. And she had wielded hers flawlessly. Weeks passed, and while his world crumbled, hers only expanded. She didn't just take the settlement and disappear. No, she did something far more calculated. She bought shares in his company, securing a controlling interest. He had thought she would take the money and leave, but she had never been interested in wealth alone. She wanted control. And now, she had it. With quiet precision, she maneuvered herself into the position he had once occupied, stepping into the world of business not as a scorned ex-wife, but as a force to be reckoned with. She didn't seek revenge. Revenge was petty, short-sighted. She sought legacy. She restructured the company, removed those who had enabled his arrogance, and built something that no longer bore his name but thrived under her leadership. And when, months later, she finally crossed paths with him at a shareholders' meeting, she saw it in his eyes: the regret, the disbelief, the fear. He had once believed she was nothing without him. But now, he understood. She had never needed him. He had needed her. In the quiet of her new office, she stood by the window, looking out over the city that had once felt so foreign, so unreachable. She thought back to the girl she had been, the woman who had dimmed her own light so that he could shine. That girl was gone now, replaced by someone sharper, stronger. She had fought for herself in ways she had never thought possible, and she had won. But more than that, she had proven that power, true power, wasn't about dominance. It was about knowing your worth. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. Her assistant stepped inside, placing a folder on her desk. "The board wants to move forward with your expansion proposal," she said with a smile. "Congratulations." She nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "Thank you." And as she looked back out over the skyline, she realized something. This wasn't just her victory. This was her beginning. Months passed, and the contrast between their lives had never been clearer. She thrived in the world he once dominated, commanding respect in boardrooms where she had once been invisible. The transition wasn't easy. Many doubted her at first, assuming she was merely the beneficiary of a high-profile divorce settlement. But time proved them wrong. Her strategies were sharp, her decisions calculated, and under her leadership, the company flourished in ways it never had before. She implemented reforms he had dismissed as unnecessary, cutting away the inefficiencies he had ignored. Employees who had once whispered about her in the halls now regarded her with admiration, some even apologizing for how they had treated her in the past. Meanwhile, he was barely holding on. The fallout from the trial had shattered his reputation, and with the financial hit he had taken, his once glamorous lifestyle became unsustainable. His penthouse, his luxury cars, his extravagant habits, one by one, they disappeared, swallowed by debts and desperate attempts to salvage what was left. Those who had once surrounded him for his wealth and power abandoned him without hesitation. Without money, without influence, he had become irrelevant. He tried to start over, pitching new business ideas to old investors, but none of them trusted him anymore. His downfall was slow and painful, and the worst part was knowing that it had been entirely of his own making. One evening, after a particularly long board meeting, she found herself walking past an upscale restaurant where she and her husband had once dined. It was a place reserved for the wealthy elite, a status symbol more than a dining experience. Out of curiosity, she glanced through the window, expecting to see the same polished executives and socialites who had once filled the space. Instead, she spotted him alone, slumped over a drink at the bar, his once flawless suit now slightly wrinkled, his expression hollow. There was no entourage, no sycophants laughing at his jokes. Just a man who had lost everything. For a brief moment, she felt something almost resembling pity. Not for the man himself, but for the version of him that had once held promise. The one she had believed in, the one she had sacrificed so much for. But that man had never really existed, not the way she had imagined. He had always been this person, blinded by his own arrogance, incapable of seeing her as an equal. The difference now was that the world saw it too. She could have gone inside, confronted him, let him see what true success looked like. But she didn't. He was no longer part of her story. He had been left behind, exactly where he belonged. Fate, however, had other plans. A week later, she found herself at a high-profile business event, a gala attended by the city's most influential figures. As she navigated the sea of power players and investors, she felt a presence before she saw him. When she turned, there he was, standing at the edge of the room, staring at her as though he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He looked different, older, somehow, as if the weight of his losses had aged him beyond his years. He hesitated before approaching, his steps slower, lacking the confidence he once carried. "I wasn't sure you'd speak to me," he admitted, his voice lacking the arrogance it once held. "I almost didn't come." She studied him, unmoved. "Then why did you?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I wanted to see if you'd gloat. Maybe I just wanted to understand how things turned out like this." A bitter smile tugged at her lips. Things turned out like this because of the choices you made, she said simply. You spent years treating me like I was nothing. And now, I am everything you wished you could be. He flinched at her words, but there was no anger in his expression, no defensiveness. Just exhaustion. I didn't know, he muttered, shaking his head. I didn't realize how much you— Stop, she interrupted, raising a hand. Don't say you didn't know. You chose not to see it. That's not the same thing. He looked away, ashamed. So this is it? He asked, his voice almost hopeful. We never speak again? She tilted her head, considering him for a moment. Then, with a soft but final voice, she answered, We stopped speaking a long time ago. With that, she turned and walked away. He didn't call after her. He didn't try to stop her. Because he knew, deep down, he knew that there was nothing left to salvage. She was no longer a part of his world, and he was no longer a part of hers. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about proving a point. This was about moving forward, about stepping fully into the life she had built for herself. A life that no longer had room for him. As she left the event that night, she took a moment to breathe in the cool night air. The city hummed around her, alive with possibility. She had spent so many years fighting for her place, for recognition, for justice. And now, standing at the peak of her success, she felt something she hadn't in years: contentment. She didn't need validation. She didn't need to see him suffer. His downfall had been inevitable, not because of her, but because of the way he had chosen to live. His arrogance had been his undoing. And her resilience had been her triumph. The lesson was clear: never underestimate the power of the person you dismiss. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's quiet. Sometimes, it waits. But when it rises, it changes everything. She had risen, and in doing so, she had rewritten the narrative that he had tried to force upon her. She had taken control of her own story. And that, she realized, was the greatest victory of all. A year later, she sat in her new office, her office overlooking the city skyline. The space was modern, sleek, filled with warmth rather than intimidation. A company that had once been built under his name now bore hers. The weight of the past was gone, replaced by an unshakable certainty in her future. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that courtroom. She had built something for herself, something no one could take away. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Her assistant poked her head inside, smiling. They're ready for you in the conference room, she said. Everything's set for the new expansion deal. She nodded, standing up and smoothing out her blazer. Perfect, she replied. She walked toward the door, pausing for just a second. Then, with quiet confidence, she stepped forward. She wasn't walking away from anything anymore. She was walking towards something. Something bigger, something greater. And this time, she wasn't just part of the story. She was the one writing it.